Hi, welcome to The View from Here. I'm Matt Driskill, live, sort of, in Singapore. That's right, we made a big move from Hong Kong. We're broadcasting live, sort of, from Singapore. Today we are continuing the SEC Speaker Series. We've got historian and writer Jason Wordie. He's talking about his latest book, Macao, People and Places, Past and Present. A little bit more about him in just a minute. Many of you know the FCC in Hong Kong. Many of you know it's a key stop on the itineraries of the most well-known people in the world who happen to be passing through the city. The View from Here is pleased to announce we've got the complete set of speeches dating all the way back to 2007, and we're uploading each and every speech from 2013 as fast as we can, and we'll start having speeches from 2014 later on this week. Speakers and topics in the series include people like Mia Farrow, famous actress, outspoken activist on China and Darfur. We've got Bill Clinton in conversation with Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of modern-day Singapore. And we've got people like Chris Patton, the last governor of Hong Kong before he was handed back to China. We've also got people like comedian, author Michael Palin of Monty Python fame, and we've got many, many more. Check back frequently on The View from Here to get the latest podcast. Don't forget, you can also log on to iTunes and subscribe to The View from Here. That way you won't miss a key speech. Just go to the iTunes store, do a search for me, Matt Driskill, or The View from Here, and subscribe. And that way each and every speech should be downloaded straight to your iPod, your iPhone, or your iPad. A little bit more about today's offering, the topic, the latest book, Macao, People and Places, Past and Present. The speaker, Jason Wordie. He's a historian and a writer. He's, according to the propaganda I've been handed, as I said, he'll be talking about his latest book, which is a social history of Macao. He talks about the people who made Macao what it is today and how he explored the small territory from north to south, east and west, to unveil the physical and geographical places that many of those familiar with Macao have left untouched. He talks about the dimensions that make Macao the uniquely special place that it is today and always has been. Jason Wordie is an established local historian and writer, gives historical lectures for a variety of local community groups and cultural organizations, in addition to various well-known corporate bodies, and he also conducts historic walks around Hong Kong, Macau, Canton, which is Guangzhou, and Humen. His books include Streets, Exploring Hong Kong Island, and its companion volume, Streets, Exploring Kowloon. For more than 10 years, he's had a series of regular columns in the South China Morning Post. It used to be a really good newspaper. His current column, called Then and Now, appears every week in the Sunday Morning Post magazine. Well, that's it for me, Matt Driskill. That's The View from Here. Stay tuned. The topic, Macao, People and Places, Past and Present. Speaker, Mr. Jason Wordie. He's a historian and a writer talking about his latest book, and he is next.
Pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Jason Wordie. Mr. Wordie, as many of you would be aware, is a well-known expert on Hong Kong's heritage. This time, he has turned his attention to our neighbor city, Macau, and its colorful history. And that is the subject of his latest book, which you will find near the exit here, and also the subject of today's presentation. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Wordie to the club.
Thank you very much indeed. Does my voice carry? That seems to be something of an echo chamber, doesn't it? Thank you again for asking me. Coming to give a talk here to such an enormous packed room of people is always a slight challenge for a somewhat challenged ego, but I will do my best. What I'm going to talk about today is my forthcoming recent book, Macao, People and Places, Past and Present, and some of the background and stories associated with that, and how I came to be interested in this and how I came to spend 25 years of my life reading about Macao and the last 6 years of it writing and researching it. In case you doubt that it did actually take about 6 years, if you see the book itself, it's a doorstop. I recommend you purchase it in pairs for weightlifting purposes. But the background to this really started, and my interest in Macao started, and how it developed and evolved into this book, not when I started writing that, but when I first went over to Macao, and that was in 1988, when I was only 21 years old. I went over to Macao, as many, many people do who are living in Hong Kong, in search of something but not quite sure what that something was. Adventure, history, colour. perhaps in due course, as you can see from the images you can see here, in search of some form of souvenir. This is one of the most popular things. Everyone comes back with a salson from Macau of an afternoon. But the interest developed and evolved as time went on. And the very first night that I was there, I stayed in the old Bella Vista Hotel when it wasn't like that. When I stayed there, it was crumbling and grubby, and you turned on the tap and the water came out brown, and I wondered whether it had been drawn from the Pearl River in front or from the cisterns in the hotel itself, and it wouldn't have really mattered because the colour was about the same. But I thought it was magic. I bathed in it all the same. But I thought the place was magic, and it spoke to me, and it continued to speak. And in the course of the next 6 years, because I was then working up at Sekong, working for the Brigade of Gurkhas, and that was from 88 to 94, I went over to Macau whenever I could. And that could be weekends, it could be during the day, it could be for a few days at a time, and gradually read and explored and was laying down what eventually became, and I didn't realise it at the time, a dividend for what we're doing now. I didn't really expect that at all to happen. But I continued to come and continued to wander about. So walking along things like the waterfront, which is still vaguely reminiscent today, I started to explore and ask questions of myself, and gradually the questions started to come into a series of answers. So just down along the southern end of the waterfront, for example, is this green building, which I'd always liked and always wondered what it was. And it was only when I started to write this book that I eventually found out that was a mess that was used by the Malayan Civil Service cadets and their police cadets, because Malaya used to send up police and civil service people to Macau to learn Cantonese before the war and into the 1950s. That was their mess. It's still there. So you've got a building which you wouldn't otherwise expect would have a connection into Southeast Asia. And that's another aspect of Macau, because we tend to think of it as a little tiny place directly across the delta from us and not really realise that it's got a global connection. And the global connection, I'll talk a bit more as we go on, extends far beyond in time and space what we would otherwise expect. So I wandered about and started in the north and ended up down to the south, and that's how this book follows. This is the Tin Hau Temple up at Mongha, or near Mongha. I showed that image because the image is what we've used for the cover, the moon gate looking into it. It's a temple that most people never even go to because it's rather outside of the visitor circuit. And then down to the south, Chukwan, looking out over there, that's the very southern end or toward the southern end of Koloan. The beach there and the view there hasn't changed very much if you know where you're looking in decades. Still delightful. And other fun things. Macau has food and it has things that have never changed. This is a little cafe that I've gone into since 1988. They sell ice creams. It's called Lai Kei. It's been there forever. They make ice cream sundaes and things like this. And it's one of the delightful aspects of Macau is that some things change, other things never alter at all. And that's been there ever since. So we included that. And then there are the village corners of Macau, little things which give you a broader aspect and a broader position. This is at the southern end of the peninsula. And then into the detail. That was the thing I wanted to look at. The broader picture and then the more telling detail. So that's a detail from that house. And then the detail takes us into broader specifics. These are some shutters. Now, of course, shutters are a common feature in Macau. They were a common feature here. But if you look at the material on them, these are lined with capiche. And capiche is mother of pearl. And that brings us down into the trade links because this was imported in large quantities from the Philippines up into South China, both in the Delta and in Macau, as window glazing in the days before glass. So you could look at that and think, oh, shuttered building, how nice, how quaint, but not necessarily see that it links us into global trade patterns and regional trade patterns that went long back before what we would expect today. And then, of course, there's the cliches, the obvious. And this is where what I've tried to explore in my book and in my writing is Macau rather beyond the obvious, because you would look, of course, at the facade of São Paulo, and everyone sees it and everyone misunderstands it. So the number of people who have been told and the number of journalists who continue to relate this, that that's the ruins of the Cathedral of Macau. And of course, it never was the cathedral. Did you know that? It was the church of the Jesuit seminary, and it was built for the training of priests for the Japan mission. So it was everything to do with China and Japan, nothing really much to do with Europe and China, and certainly not the cathedral. So this is where, if one looks, you get the broader picture, which is so often misunderstood. And then that brings us down into the specific, because at the very corner of that structure, everyone goes to see it. It's the visitors' tourist trap. I was there yesterday, and it's just swarming with people. Everyone sees the facade. No one really notices the cornerstone, which records in a fairly loose Dog Latin translation, the Holy Virgin Mother, to the Holy Virgin Mother, the people of Macao built this by their own free will in 1602. But the reason it was built was as refugee relief, because the early Portuguese presence in Japan led to the introduction of Catholicism, and by the 1590s, the Tokugawa shogunate was starting to realise that they were probably more trouble than they were worth, and gradually started to crack down upon them. And large numbers came down to Macao and settled there. So Macao is a place of refuge, which I shall come on to a little bit later. It's really started then, and the early mothers and fathers of the creolised community there were Japanese Catholic converts, in the same way that the subsequent community there, which developed from the 1640s onwards and which is reflected in the old family photographs of people there, look much more Malay, Filipino in that sense, because they came up from Malacca. It's so very, very interesting and so often overlooked. So that's one of the corners. And then that leads us down to the more unexpected, the more suspected and unexpected, the Santa Casa, the Yanzitong, right in the middle of town. The leading Portuguese charity in the overseas world, set up in the 14th century with a branch in Macao. Everyone walks past it. Very few people go in it. But if you do, you'll see all sorts of interesting things. That's an oil portrait of the first Catholic bishop in Macao, a Canero, and you might notice there's a glass case in front containing his skull. He was subsequently exhumed, and there you have him as a Catholic relic. So it's one of those curious things. Everyone wanders about, no one sees the macabre and the creepy. But I do, I did. Also in the Santa Casa is this portrait of Martha Meerup. And Martha Meerup was a Muay who was sold, as Muay were, and eventually was taken up by one of the East India Company officers. They formed a genuine relationship rather than just sort of use and abuse and throw away. And he subsequently left her all his money. And she subsequently left all her money to the Santa Casa, which is why her portrait's in there. But I show that portrait because her story was written up most beautifully by Austin Coates in City of Broken Promises in the 1960s. And Austin was very good at taking other people's stories and using them for himself. This was actually Jack Braga's research, and he did the research, and then Austin wrote it up. But never mind, we've all enjoyed the story, and it's very nice. And Martha Meerup's portrait can be seen there. But then there's other links. There's the lighthouse at Gia. Everyone goes past it and sees it flashing in the night. It was the oldest lighthouse on the China coast, still there today, still flashes. It also has a bell which dates back to the 16th century, and that's a link to Japan too, because it was the Portuguese from Macau that introduced firearms into Japan. And at Tanegashima, they have a festival every 10 years, the Teppo Festival, which commemorates the introduction of firearms into Japan. Lee Kuan Yew, about 20 years ago, said that having such a festival was a little bit like commemorating giving liqueur chocolates to an alcoholic. But of course, well, Harry Lee can say that kind of thing. But it's the other side, because the church bells were cast as well. So as well as sending up guns, they sent up church bells. So all things bright and beautiful, eh? Down in the centre of town, the pastel-coloured view is what so many day visitors see in Macau. And everyone notices this and thinks beautiful pastel view and think, how lovely, how beautiful, how wonderful Macau must have been back before the casinos and so on, and not really realise that Macau has always had its dark side, a very dark side. When W.H. Auden and Christopher Isherwood went through in 1939, Auden wrote a poem about Macau in which he described it as a weed from Catholic Europe which had taken root. And of course, as the Japanese had recognised, if you've got weeds in the garden, you pull them up and throw them away. Otherwise, they take over. And they've had fairly much done so in Macau. But I point that up because the weed, of course, can be seen as either the church or the other things behind it. And there you can see Santo Agostinho, beautiful, lovely. Everyone goes past it. They don't see inside. That's a gravestone of a young girl who was one of the heiresses in Macau in the 1720s, at the time when Macau had collapsed economically after the closure of the Japan trade. And two men fought a duel in order to marry her. And one of them did indeed win the duel and married her. She was only 9 at the time, and she died in childbirth 2 years later. And that's her gravestone, which records that it has her and her daughter and the right arm of her husband, because he lost the arm in the duel, getting it in the first place. But that's one side. The other is the names, because if you look, her name was Maria de Moura, and his surname was Coelho. And that's actually a link to the overseas Portuguese world, because de Moura indicates of the Moors. So these were Muslim converts at the time of Ferdinand and Isabella. His surname, Coelho, it means rabbit. And this was another thing which had gone on. Those who had got away from the persecutions in Spain and Portugal went overseas because they were forced to become Catholic, and they were given names that reflected that Novo Cristão status, as they call it, new Christians. Coelho is one, rabbit. Lagosta is another, lobster. Leiton is another, which is suckling pig. So the idea being, give them a name of something that they can't actually eat, and then, of course, next time you want a pogrom, you can identify them. It's a thing worth mentioning. But I think that's the dark side of the churches. And the other dark side, an attractive side, is the orphanage in the northern part of the city. That was opened by the Canossian nuns, and it took in, beautiful building, and it took in between the 1870s and 1931, 1,200 boys and 34,000 girls. Most of those unwanted refugees from the mainland. Another, on the inner harbour, we'd look at this building and think, how beautiful, isn't that lovely, pastel painted, let's get a picture in front of it. It's an opium warehouse. Macao had a legalised drug trade. It was one of the last places in the Far East where you could purchase one of four varieties of heroin over the counter, colour-coded for the illiterate, up until 1959. Likewise, another archway in a back street. One would walk past and think, oh, how lovely, how beautiful. That was one of the coolie barracoons, because Macao had a slave trade. Right up into the 1880s, you had illiterate, impoverished Chinese from the Delta who were effectively shanghaied from there and ended up as virtual slaves in Peru and Cuba and so on. And having been got down to Macao, they were got out and overseas. So that was where they were kept before they were put on the ships and never seen no more, no more. I mention it because when one wanders about in Macao, you can see these beautiful things and think, oh, how lovely the old Macao must have been in comparison to the tawdriness of today. Not so. Then there are other little fragments. This is at the fort at Mont, and that's a link to Salazar's Portugal, because there was an African garrison in Macao into the 1970s, and these were from Angola and Mozambique. And the sign in there, very nationalistic. In translation, it says, halt, attention, record for an instant the beautiful history of your country and enter with your head high as a soldier of your country. All very nice, all very nationalistic. But it's a link to that time of the fascist world. There are other connections. This is a gravestone of the first ever Indian baronet, Sir FCCHK2013. Wonderful name. He was the cotton broker for Jardines, and he was back and forth to Macao numerous times and subsequently died and is buried there in the Parsi cemetery. The thing with Macao is people tend to assume it's something to do with Europe and China, but it's China and Europe and the rest of the world too. So Parsi merchants, Parsi traders, Armenians, many others. You can see a portrait of FCCHK2013 in the House of 1,000 Portholes if you go down and ask nicely. And then there are others. This is a memorial window to Pedro Nolasco da Silva. He was a very, very well-known Macao figure in the late 19th century. He controlled newspapers as well as other businesses. And he published his newspapers in Hong Kong to avoid the wrath of the censors in Macao. So whenever he had an axe to grind, he'd publish a paper here and then send it over there. And when the axe had been successfully ground, he closed down the paper. It's what publishers do. I think proprietors do the same. He made a lot of money, as did his sons. This is one of the sons' houses. It's now the Monetary Authority. It's called Casa Branca. And the house next door to it was Villa Alegre. One's a school now, the other one's a monetary authority. But it's where it comes on. And these are all and around and about. And the thing which is so lovely with Macao is it's a legacy to earlier times, because you look at that and you would think, well, it could be in Hong Kong in the 40s or 50s. There were houses like that, but they're not now. And then there are other people. The thing that I've explored are people that one mightn't necessarily think of. And this little pavilion, so many people go past it in Macao and notice it, but not really realise what it is. It's a reading room, which was set up by the Macao Chamber of Commerce, and it was personally and entirely funded by Ho Yin. Now, people forget about Ho Yin. He was one of the leading figures of Macao for decades, and also an incredibly leading China patriot. An enormous amount of material would not have got into that country in the 1950s and 60s without his support. And the thing with the reading room is it contains an enormous amount of interesting material, because the victory of socialism, as they liked it to be, was that there was such a thing as high culture, and it was there for everybody. So this opened up at night, and people could go and read periodicals, not only from China, but from right across the Chinese diaspora. And it was all for free, and it's still there. Likewise, Kongwoi, these workers' associations. This is for the carpenters, but they're all over in Macau too. Macau's always been very leftist, very pro-China, and people wonder why. It goes back down to people like Ho Yin, right from the very beginning at that time. Then there are other interesting individuals. This is a pawnbroker's storage tower, and the major company was called Duxeng, and that was run by a couple of interesting individuals. One was Go Huaneng, who died in the 1950s. They controlled the pawnbroking business, and pawnbroking was in many respects Chinese banking of its day. We tend to think you go into a pawnbroker's if you run out of money. It was actually short-term credit. That's all over there too. I've included the stories and explored the lives of these people. Another was the Low family, and this is their house, which is now the Puiqing School, up in the north of the city. They're all around about. Then there are people who are remembered, but often remembered inaccurately. The Kangwu Hospital has a statue of Sun Yat-sen, and people tend to assume, the so-called founder of modern China and his connections into Macau. Very good. He didn't spend much time there. Most of the time in Macau, and that's the Memorial House, which so many people go and see, most of the time in Macau was spent by his cruelly discarded first wife, Lo Mucheng, because after he realised that actually the Song family had a bit more money, he put the first wife to one side, left her down in Macau, and she stayed there until she died in 1952. So that's the backstory of Sun Yat-sen, which many nationalists don't like to be reminded. You go into the building, and I'm not really susceptible to vibes, but there's a palpable feeling in there of, get out. It's got a really not nice feeling in the building, as though there was a discarded wife in there. Then there's the waterfront in Taipa. We can see these buildings, old government quarters, and they're beautiful and well maintained, and they give you a window on an earlier time, but also onto other connections, the dairy in the northern part of the city. The dairy, of course, Chinese didn't eat milk. The introduction of so many food products came into China from Macau. Dairy products in the south, but also chilies. The Portuguese introduced the chili into maritime Asia. They introduced yams. They introduced sweet corn and maize. The amount of food products that came in from the other parts of the world, tomatoes, all of these Central American things came in through Macau. And you imagine Indian food or Thai food without chilies. Well, that was what it was like 600 years ago until these people came. So I look at a building like that and I don't just see a lovely old dairy, I tend to think of the world side of it. Then there's connections to Hong Kong. That's the manager's bungalow of the Green Island Cement Company, because Green Island Cement was originally over there. The Green Island on the packet was the Green Island in the northern part of Macau. That was sold up and moved here in the 1920s, but the bungalow is still there. Then there's the other architecture that people walk past. Everyone gets really besotted over there by the tropical Baroque, and they ignore the interwar, because the Moderne, the Bauhaus, the Deco influence is there. And you've got this back street shop, which looks like the prow of a ship. Isn't it marvellous? There's so much of that. The old Kwok Chai Hotel down on the inner harbour, the second of the high-rise buildings there. Cinema Allegria in the northern part of the city. Sconces at Skyline. Skyline was owned by Freddie Gallion, who was the manager of the Macau Electric. That's up at the top of ridge at Penna, and I have envied and coveted that house from the moment I first went over there. I'll never have it, but I've coveted it. I've mentioned this because we tend not to see that interwar building, and there's so much of it there. And why is it there? Because poverty is an enormous preserver. Macau didn't go ahead for a very long time, so those buildings stayed and remained. But Macau did go ahead in other ways, and it's where little buildings give a story. This is the Morrison Chapel in the East India Company Cemetery. Now, the thing with this is it's a link to the changing role of women, because the first ever female vicar in the Anglican Church was ordained for service there during the war. It had to start somewhere. It started over there, and it was the Anglican Bishop of Hong Kong, Bishop Hall, who ordained her, because they didn't have a suitable European male. They couldn't get in a suitable Chinese female. He read the instruction book, and clearly there was nothing in there that he could find. So Florence Lee it was. So the first ever female vicar was actually a Chinese lady brought in there during the war. So you get a link to that, and there's a picture of her there. But this is where actually the story starts to turn a little bit personal in terms of my own research. Because when I was at Hong Kong U in the mid-90s, I had a book out called Ruins of War, and that was out in 1996 when I was still studying. And in the course of doing that, and before that, I came to know Lady Ride, May Ride, and May was the widow of the Vice-Chancellor at Hong Kong U, and Sir Lindsay and her had pulled together manuscripts, extensive manuscripts on the East India Company cemetery, and they'd been working on that for years, and that was subsequently published. But there was another side to it, which is the Portuguese stones and statues and memorials, and that had never been finished. And once we were having dinner, and May got all very excited at the sight of the Ruins of War manuscript, and she said, "You've got to have the stones." "What stones are these, May?" "Well, the stones. She was very keyed up with it. Anyway, the upshot of it is I started to work on that project, which was subsequently out in 1999. But the cemetery there was a link to it because they had restored that. That was their personal project in the 1950s. It was in ruin. They pulled it all together and got it all sorted. So that was what they were doing. And that's, again, a view in the cemetery with stones that they rescued actually from a scrap heap. The Director of Public Works was going to grind them up for road gravel and said to them one weekend, "Well, would you like them?" "Oh, yes, we will." So they ended up in there. But in the course of that, too, it was fun because I started working on that project, and that took a couple of years. And Colonel Hewitt, Tony Hewitt, who'd written the foreword for me for Ruins of War, he lived near my parents in Queensland. And he had been a prisoner of war in Hong Kong for a month, didn't enjoy it very much and escaped successfully. He was the one that actually tied the white flag on the pole in 1941. So when he came up again in 97, he and Lizzie and I went up to South China, going back on his escape. And then we ended up back down in Macao because Lizzie had had part of her childhood in Macao because her father had been the Commissioner of Maritime Customs. So we hunted around there and found the Customs Commissioner's residence and went to see Father Teixeira, who she'd known when he was 12 and she was about 6. It was a fantastic day. But I mention this because I was down staying with them a couple of months later before going over to England to see May and go through the other work we were doing. And she said, "Oh, did you know that Mary had written a book on this?" Mary, her sister, is a playwright. And I said, "Well, I didn't know about that." So she fished it down from the bookshelves and showed me. It's called "What Shall We Do Tomorrow?" It's a nice sort of pleasant title. And I've quoted extensively from that. This is a view looking out toward the Nile Islands because Mary wrote extensively about this. Went over to England and did indeed go and see her, and she was something else again. I can well see why she was a gift to the Daily Mail. She was another person. But there's again some of the view that Mary Haley Bell wrote about. It's delightful. But then there's Macao and the war, and that brings it down to where I'll work toward concluding and how that story evolved, because Macao was surrounded but not occupied. That was the position in Macao with Portuguese neutrality. And the place was full of refugees from Hong Kong, and Macao had been a refuge of refugees, as I said, down the centuries. And in 1943, the Japanese made an attempt to get further representation with the government there, and they were resisted pretty strongly by the administration, and a service was held in the cathedral to the Virgin of Fatima, and you can see there the inscription that was put up translates out as "Queen of the World, Mother of Portugal, help Macao." Well, of course, the tide of the war was turning, nevertheless, but maybe the Virgin of Fatima listened too, who knows. The upshot of it was that the Japanese backed off. But that linked in further, because Macao during the war, as I said, was full of refugees, and they were treated very hospitably. The Macao government turned over the entire proportion that they got from the gambling revenue for their support. Every pataka went over to help them. And there was a hockey match held as a charity thing on the hockey ground, and that's the old hockey clubhouse overlooking the kampong. It's a well-known story that there was a team from Hong Kong and a team from Macao, so a home and away team, and the Hong Kong team had been given jerseys with an R on the back to identify them, the R being refugiado, refugee. And the governor, Gabriel Teixeira, showed up for this, and before the match started, he said, "Oh, and what's that?" "Oh, refugiado." "Oh, no. They had to take all these things off, they had to find new ones, and it was said this, and it went around the town like lightning, because the comment he made was, "These are not refugees, they are our guests." Isn't that lovely? And in some ways it goes quite a way toward mitigating the slavery and beggary and other things. But then that links us down, because one of the leading Macao figures at that time, who was a great personal assistance to the refugees, was Dr. Lobo. And P.J. Lobo was the leading Macao figure through that time. Here he is. He was a very amateur, very enthusiastic, but equally amateur conductor and composer, and he used to write his own music, and there he is conducting it. But he paid personally for numerous refugees out of his own pocket, and one in particular was the family of a White Russian painter called George Smirnoff. And the Smirnoffs went over to Macao in 1944, having been bombed out of their house. And they painted a whole series of views, and the father painted a whole series of views of what the city looked like at that time. And I encountered these pictures, and I thought, this would make a nice cover. And I mentioned this to May Ride, and I said, have you ever seen these pictures? I said, yes. Well, she said, of course I know them. She said, you must meet the daughter. I said, who's the daughter? The daughter's Nina, and Nina's sitting there. So we came to know all of this and see it all, and we decided to use them. And it was quite marvellous, because as a result of that, other things evolved. I mentioned Dr. Lobo before. Not only was he such a benefactor in Macau during the war, it was largely due to him that we managed that Hong Kong indeed got British rule again, because Macau was surrounded. The British consulate there continued to operate. Word was got out that the war was over, and it was got into Hong Kong by messengers which he sent. One of them's Sir Roger, his son, who brought over the piece of paper. So that was in 1945. So it all links in, and it connects most wonderfully well. So that was with that book, and it was delightful. But in the course of it all, I thought, well, we must find out more about these paintings and their most beautiful things, so I found the house. And the house is still there, Patio de Seis Casas, where they lived. And that was where the war was spent, where Nina spent part of her early childhood. But the book, as it developed and evolved, became friends with Nina, but also friends with her older sister Irene, and Irene wrote the foreword, because Irene's memories of Macau during the war are a little bit older. Nina's only a baby. And there you go. The little blonde tot is sitting there, and the dark-haired tot who wrote the foreword for me now lives in Florida. But it's where these stories all come together and coalesce, and it's where Macau, for me, isn't only a place, it's a whole series of personal and interesting journeys, and I've found it most interesting and a great delight to write, and enormously enriching, coming to know many of these people, some of whom are now sadly and no longer around with us. The acknowledgement section in my book, actually, it's the late, and one of my ruder friends looked at it and said, do you have any living friends? Yes, I do. Thank you for listening to me.
That was marvellous.
Before I do take any questions, I would mention one thing. The book is for sale over there. That's a little bit of a sales pitch to it. Mrs. Koenig, who manages everything wonderfully for my life, is there. But I would say I'm giving 20% of the proceed of this, if ever you wanted to purchase it and feel like you're doing something very good, to the group who's sitting over here, because there's a very wonderful and worthwhile organisation in Hong Kong called Project Touch, which works with the Boys and Girls Clubs Association. And they do a great deal to assist youth who are dealing with homophobic bullying, issues related to sexual orientation in schools and so on. They do an enormous amount of very, very good work with extremely limited resources. The resources, of course, in Hong Kong are hugely limited because of the pernicious effect of the religious groups on top-level government decisions. But that has to be combated and will be combated, and one does what one can. Mrs. Marden has been very kind and very generous to them. She, of course, has got a much bigger pocketbook than me, but one does what one can, so 20% goes to them. Are there any questions?
Now, would you please raise your hand and then wait for the mic to appear and perhaps give us your name?
There's one hand.
Gentleman on the right.
I'm Bob Meyer. I'm impressed that so many old buildings still around in Macau, and noted your point that poverty results inadvertently in preservation. Is there any statutory preservation now? What's to prevent some of these buildings being knocked down? Is there a firm feeling in Macau that we're going to
Macau has a UNESCO World Heritage listing for the historic core in the middle of town. So if you've got a UNESCO core listing, as with Georgetown or Angkor or many others, that actually puts protocols on what you can do within a certain area. Then you go into a transition zone, and then you go into a sort of free-for-all, which you can see on the periphery there. So yes, very, very much so. Yeah, very, very, very much so. And of course, the thing over there with historic conservation is it's gradually been recognised and realised that this is something that monetises, because people will keep going back. So it's actually, in that sense, belatedly recognised as an enormous public asset, but also a recurrent public asset, because people who dive in for a casino will go once and then go back wherever. Well, they might come back once or twice, but the smaller museums and the historical and heritage aspect, people keep coming back, and they'll stay another night in a hotel room, and they'll keep putting food into restaurants and stuff like that. So yes, very much. I should have mentioned earlier, and I didn't, and I was too busy talking about my own stories. The photography in all of this, with the exception of Dr. Lobo and Nina and her sister, were done by Dr. Colin Day of Hong Kong University Press and Professor Tony Headley, who is the Professor of Community Medicine at Hong Kong U. And they'd done my two earlier books, one on Hong Kong Island and one on Kowloon. And we had great good fun weekend after weekend over there looking around at various things, and they both got a superb eye. So the photographs in this are all their original work, and this would not have appeared in any way, certainly not in the way that it is, without Colin and Tony's expert work. So.
Hi, I'm Edith Terry. I have a similar question. Hong Kong has taken such a kind of a lackadaisical approach towards archival preservation. What is the situation in Macau?
Right, well, archival situation. Archival legislation in Macau is superb, as indeed it is on the mainland. Hong Kong is enormously retrograde with that, and of course retrograde archive legislation is enormous aid to top-level government corruption, which is of course a massive issue at this time. Because if you don't have the records, you can't do a proper ICAC search on who is taking what and where. It really does leave you to think exactly what certain top-level people were thinking when they skipped it all in the move from the government offices over to the new duck house. You've got to ask yourself. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but you've really got to ask yourself. But no, in Macau in particular, the archives are very good, often rather patchy, simply because climate, termites, all of those kinds of things mean that things are a little bit ropier than they should be. But the staff are very good, and their archival legislation is in line with what is the national requirement, and Hong Kong's totally deficient in that.
Next question. Lady in front of Edith.
What's happened to the Portuguese? I'm Jane Hong. What happened to the Portuguese population since the handover? Is it still active? What are they doing?
It's actually expanded. This is the whole thing. What you find now, because Portugal has got such an enormous economic downturn, is that people are coming out to the Far East in search of opportunity. And the thing which people tend not to realise, certainly in Hong Kong, because people here can be so self-important and smug when they look down on their little neighbour across the delta, is that the Portuguese world is huge. If you have Portuguese language skills, it's Angola, it's Mozambique, it's Guinea-Bissau, it's Brazil, that's what they speak. So there's an enormous reason, actually, for learning Portuguese. The more people speak it than you would think. Portuguese language courses over there are always oversubscribed. So there's actually much more than one would think. But of course, from Hong Kong, they tend to look and go, oh, well, they just spin the dice over there, and it's, no, more than one would think. And interestingly enough, what you've got is the Macaista, and this is the Creolised population from Hong Kong as well, who for many years drifted out to Sydney and San Francisco and other places. There are actually more Hong Kong Portuguese now in the San Francisco Bay Area than there are in Hong Kong and Macau combined, interestingly. They say that Club Lusitano, half of the membership are overseas and the other half are over 90, and it's about right. But the thing with that is that they've gradually drifted back too. And why have they drifted back? Because the future's happened and it's actually been rather a good one. Instead of what's going to happen what's going to happen when, what will they do? Well, actually, they've been pretty good. And people recognise that. So yes, yeah. Go over, check it out.
Tara, you have a question for Jason.
Yes, I'm Tara Joseph with Reuters. Jason, thanks for a fascinating view of Macau. I see your book is People and Places Past and Present, and it's a breath of fresh air to talk about Macau for an hour and not really mention the casinos. But overall...
They're unmentionable.
The history, everything that you mentioned, the rich culture, is it not being entirely overtaken by the casinos, and what's going to be the net
It's the
effect?
casinos that pay for it, because what people forget before is, where do they get the money from in the first place? It's a little tiny place. It was the casinos that expanded it in the 20s. Let me give you a 2-minute potted summary of this. The casinos started off in 1848 after Hong Kong had been established, because Macau previously was a service centre. It was where merchants and traders of various ethnicities did their banking and lived and so on. So after Hong Kong was established, they had to find another role. And legalised gambling was the means by which the money went into the exchequer. Now, it was a very inefficient means through the 19th century because it was tax farming. It was a whole variety of tenders and farms, as they were called. But that was rationalised in 1922 with the Dai Hing monopoly. And the Dai Hing monopoly was the Lo family, Goh Ho Neng and a few others. Fu Tak Yam was the big one. I mean, he started out selling Yao Zha Kwai and ended up squillionaire. What they did with the 40-year monopoly they got from 1922 is they had to pay for the port and infrastructure work, they had to build the reservoir. All of that was funded by it. So it was, right, you've got it for 40 years, but you've got to build that, and that. So the real takeoff was then, infrastructure. Then in 62, they lost that, and it was Stanley Ho and Henry Fock and Teddy Yip and their merry men got it for another 40 years. But it was the same thing. They then built the outer maritime terminal. They built the bridges. If you didn't have that, you wouldn't have had the rest. So what you've got now is the amount of funding which goes into archives, preservation, all of that. Where do you think it's going to come from? That's what people often don't ask. In the same way with Hong Kong in the 1960s and 70s, there were squatters on every hillside. You know, there were other priorities. Until 1971, there was no free primary education in Hong Kong. So we look and say, why do they pull down those buildings? Because they had better things to do, better things to spend the money on at that time. So yes, to go back into the issue of gambling, it's in a number of peripheral areas, and my personal view on them, I didn't cover them in the book because I think most of them are foul. In terms of something to go and look at, they're most depressing things in many ways. It reminds me of something a Hawaiian friend once said to me about Waikiki, and that is, well, you want the chickens and you want the eggs, but you don't necessarily want to live in the coop. And it's a similar thing, actually, with any visitor to Hawaii would tell you that. The same thing with Macau. Bring them in, funnel them over, get the money out of them, buy, and have the rest of the town, which is quite nice. And there are large parts of the town where you can wander about and you never need touch it.
So the casinos are a good thing?
They're a necessary thing. I wouldn't like to ascribe the value judgment to it in the same way if we go back before. Things like the gold trade. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? I would suggest it was a thing. And again, I can't but mention this. Dr. Lobo, who I mentioned in here before, was most cruelly and very wrongly maligned by Ian Fleming, because Ian Fleming, aided and abetted by the sort of man in the bus downstairs, Dick Hughes, a sort of lunchtime alcoholic legend, went over to interview Dr. Lobo and got some information from him, thought he was something to caricature, and went off and wrote Goldfinger, which is disgusting, because you had someone, as I say, who was paying for hundreds of people's pockets, living out of his own pockets, and was a legitimate businessman, and was loudly calumniated by that. No one remembers that, and it's very wrong. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Gentleman in front.
Thank you. My name is Mark Zawadzki. I'm with Asia to Go company. Jason, a bit of more general question. If I would like to ask you to compare like British colonialism and Portuguese colonialism, like which is the most favorite? Like which one is your favorite? Like speaking from historian point of view.
Well, of course. Given that we have the presence of the British Consul General, I must indeed say it was Britain, mustn't I? But it depends what you mean. I mean, it's far too general a question to give any meaningful answer in even an hour or so. I'd suggest the Portuguese were more picturesque. They've certainly left better food. It's very definitely the case there. I don't even know how to begin to answer such a broad question, I'm sorry. I would also say with the picturesqueness, you could really say that simply because Portugal did so little for so very long, because they were so poor, they left a bit better architectural legacy, because what they left was buildings and food and people and music and those other things you can touch and feel and enjoy and experience. So I'd guess there was that, but I'm sorry, that's not a very comprehensive answer to what was a very diffuse question. Are there any other questions? I could probably manage one in.
Okay, one more.
Oh, there's two. All right. Well.
My name is Reuben Tuck. I and my wife live in Macau. We were married in Macau at Gia Lighthouse by Father Lancelot.
Oh, okay. Not long died. Yeah.
And we were wondering why you spell it with an O rather than a U.
All right. The reason I spell it with an O rather than a U is that's what the UN use. Because the United Nations formal term in English for Macau uses a U, an O rather, in the same way that Brazil in English has a Z, in Portuguese has an S. Mozambique has a Z, in Portuguese it has a C with a cedilla. The reason it's widely used with a U is, of course, after STDM took on in 1962, that became their house style. They bought lots of advertising. In due course, the newspapers started to use it. But that using Macau with a U is, to my mind, a little bit like referring to Lisbon as Lisboa if you're using an English usage. It's, in that sense, a bit affected. So that's why I've used that. That's actually the UN correct term for an English publication. Yeah. Right, okay. And Philip was the one that did the design and the publication, so we must thank Philip. It was wonderful. Give him lots of work. It was excellent. I recommend.
I'm afraid that's really all the time we have for today's wonderful presentation. On behalf of the club, we have a little souvenir for you, Jason.
That's scary.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening, and I would also, just before we run, thank Ms. Wilson, Carolyn Wilson, the British CG, for coming, Mrs. Nina Bega, who of course is a historian this is much of, and Sir Roger Lobo, whose father I spoke of before. Thank you.